and African Free Trade Area integration.
For over 30 years, Japan and Africa have built solid trust.
When the curtains rose on the 9th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, or TICAD 9, in August 2025, Japan wanted to showcase something symbolic. A gesture that would signal its intent to step closer to Africa, not just through grand infrastructure deals or billion-dollar investments, but through something softer and more human. Amid hundreds of cooperation agreements in energy, technology, and healthcare, one initiative stood out: the Hometown Project. Announced by the Japan International Cooperation Agency JITSA, it promised to pair 4 Japanese cities, Saitama, Fukuoka, Shizuoka, and Osaka, with 4 African nations: Ghana, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Tanzania. The idea was rooted in memory. During the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, athletes from these African nations had trained and competed in those very cities, leaving behind friendships, stories, and impressions. The Hometown Project was meant to preserve that connection. Cultural festivals, student exchanges, and workshops would carry the Olympic spirit forward, transforming fleeting encounters into lasting bonds. It was supposed to be a feel-good moment, an applause line in a conference filled with trade numbers and diplomatic speeches. But almost overnight, the project became something very different. Instead of excitement, alarm spread across Japan. Posts on social media began claiming this was not about culture at all. According to viral rumors, the Hometown Project was a covert immigration scheme designed to allow Africans to settle in Japan under special visas. Hashtags about protecting Japan's identity and fears of mass African migration shot up on X and TikTok. Within days, right-wing activists hit the streets. In Shinjuku, Tokyo's busiest district, demonstrators waved signs that read "No to Mass Immigration" and "Protect Japan's Future." Similar rallies emerged in Osaka and Yokohama, where loudspeakers warned of crime, unemployment, and even public health risks. One protest leader went as far as shouting about Ebola as if it were about to arrive on the next flight from Lagos. The protests were not huge in number, but they were loud enough to dominate headlines. Japanese television ran footage of angry crowds chanting in front of glass towers, while newspapers framed the Hometown Project as a deeply divisive issue. For Africans watching from abroad, the coverage was shocking. What was supposed to be a symbolic handshake of friendship had been recast as a national security threat. Confusion spread quickly. Some African outlets, rushing to cover the story, repeated the visa claims without verification. To Africans in Accra or Lagos, it looked as if Japan was opening its doors. To ordinary Japanese citizens, it looked like the government was secretly planning a wave of immigration. Both interpretations were false, but by the time corrections appeared, the damage was done. By the end of August, Japan's carefully crafted outreach to Africa was no longer seen as a diplomatic initiative. It was a domestic scandal. The very phrase African hometown had become toxic, dragged from the warm language of cultural partnership into the cold battlefield of identity politics. How did a harmless cultural exchange turn into a story of migration and fear? And why did the narrative take root so quickly in a country that prides itself on control? To understand this, we need to return to what Japan was really trying to achieve. The Hometown Project was never about immigration. It was born from Japan's strategy of soft diplomacy. Lacking the financial muscle of China or the US, Tokyo has long leaned on symbolism and cultural initiatives to deepen ties with Africa. By pairing cities with nations, it wanted to say, "We are not just investors, we want to be part of your story too." The strategy carried generational logic as well. Africa is the world's youngest continent, with nearly 70% of its people under the age of 30. By focusing on cultural exchanges, Japan hoped to build goodwill with the future leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs of Africa, seeds that might bear fruit decades later. But the project had a fatal weakness: communication. The language of hometowns was catchy but vague. To Africans, it suggested permanent adoption, as if Japanese cities were welcoming African communities indefinitely. To Japanese audiences already anxious about immigration, it sounded like residency rights or new visas. That gap between intention and perception left the door wide open for distortion. And distortion came quickly. A handful of careless headlines abroad framed the project as a visa scheme. Social media exaggerated further, painting visions of thousands of Africans settling in Japanese neighborhoods. TikTok creators speculated about schools filling with African children. On X, memes showed maps of cities before and after an imagined African influx. The narrative resonated in Japan because of existing anxieties. Japan has one of the lowest foreign resident populations among developed nations and prides itself on cultural homogeneity. Any suggestion of large-scale immigration, particularly from regions viewed through stereotypes, immediately triggers fear. That fear became fertile ground for rumor. Online forums exploded with debate. Would Japanese workers lose jobs? Would crime spike? Would hospitals be overwhelmed by diseases? None of it was based in fact, but fear spreads faster than corrections. Right-wing groups seized the moment. Japan's far right, which has long campaigned against immigrants from Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, now found a new symbol in Africa. They plastered posters in neighborhoods warning of an African influx, and slogans like "Defend Japan's Purity" gained traction. For them, the facts of the project were irrelevant. What mattered was weaponizing fear. The mainstream media, while not endorsing these rumors, still amplified them. Evening news showed angry crowds and divided reactions. Headlines suggested two equally valid sides, pro and anti-hometown project, when in reality, one was grounded entirely in misinformation. Even cautious reporting legitimized the falsehoods. For Africans, the spectacle was painful. Nations that had celebrated Japan's recognition suddenly saw themselves cast as a threat. Social media across Africa voiced confusion, frustration, and even anger at how a symbolic partnership had been twisted. The irony was bitter. The very people meant to benefit from cultural bridges were now painted as villains. The Hometown Project became a case study in how fragile international cooperation is in the face of misinformation. It showed how easily a gesture of friendship can be hijacked by rumor, fear, and prejudice. Faced with this storm, Japan's leaders had no choice but to act. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba appeared on television not to boast about new Africa ties, but to deny what the project was not. He assured the public there would be no mass immigration, no visas, no permanent settlement. It was an unusual sight, a leader clarifying not what a policy does, but what it doesn't do. The chief cabinet secretary echoed him in press briefings, stressing again and again, "This is about friendship, not migration." JITSA published a detailed FAQ debunking the most common rumors and even contacted African outlets to correct misleading reports. Yet the backlash did not vanish. Protests continued, though smaller. Right-wing activists accused the government of a cover-up. Conspiracy theories mutated online. If leaders were denying it so strongly, wasn't that proof it was true? In this way, every clarification seemed to feed paranoia. What stood out was the government's defensive tone. Instead of highlighting the value of cultural exchange, officials appeared nervous, almost apologetic for engaging Africa at all. To African observers, it signaled something deeper. Japan wanted Africa's markets and talent, but still struggled to embrace Africans themselves. The episode revealed a contradiction. Japan brands itself globally as a responsible partner to Africa, eager to support development through TICAD, infrastructure projects, and aid. Yet domestically, its politics remained shaped by insularity and cultural anxiety. The Hometown Project was supposed to humanize diplomacy, but it exposed this tension instead. Analysts noted how much energy Tokyo spent firefighting rumors instead of celebrating over 300 cooperation deals signed at TICAD 9. The intended story, Japan deepening Africa ties, was drowned out by an unintended one: Japan's fear of Africans. This nervous cleanup achieved only partial success. It slowed misinformation but could not erase the doubts planted in people's minds. And it left an aftertaste. If Japanese society reacted this strongly to a symbolic project, what would happen when deeper exchanges followed? For Africa, the lessons are sobering but also empowering. On one hand, the backlash is a reminder of how prejudice still shapes perceptions of the continent. Myths about disease, crime, and cultural incompatibility can resurface instantly, even in advanced societies. On the other hand, it shows Africa's growing influence. For decades, African nations were treated as footnotes in global diplomacy, recipients of aid, markets on the margins. But this episode revealed how much that has changed. A single symbolic project involving 4 African nations was enough to dominate headlines, rattle Japanese politics, and force a prime minister's televised statement. That is not the reaction to a continent on the sidelines. It is the reaction to a continent whose presence can no longer be ignored. What frightened parts of Japanese society was not Africans arriving, but Africans becoming part of Japan's national imagination. That in itself is proof of Africa's rising leverage, so how should Africa use it? The answer is not to retreat from partnerships when xenophobia appears, but to keep building with confidence. Africa's value rests not on the approval of others, but on its own resources, youth, innovation, and culture. The African Continental Free Trade Area, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, and new industrialization drives are all signs that Africa is charting its own path. If Japan hesitates, Africa has other partners. China continues Belt and Road projects. India deepens trade and technology ties. Russia, Turkey, and Gulf nations invest in infrastructure and energy. Even within Africa, regional blocs are integrating at speeds unthinkable a generation ago in this crowded field. Japan risks falling behind if domestic fears outweigh its global ambitions. For Africa, that is not a setback, it is leverage. If one door closes, others are open. And every backlash abroad is, in its own way, confirmation of Africa's rising power. The Hometown Project was supposed to be a small cultural gesture. Instead, it revealed both Japan's fears and Africa's ascent. Japan may have reassured its citizens that no Africans were coming to stay. But the truth is, Africa has already arrived on the global stage, and it is not leaving. Africa does not need permission to shine. It only needs to keep moving forward, confident that its presence is powerful enough to shake the world. Even when it doesn't intend to. Do you think Japan's backlash shows weakness in its society or strength in Africa's rising influence? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more videos on Black culture, history, and Africa's place in the world, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, stay tuned.